Top 10 Serial Killers in America. Number 10, Larry Eyler. Eyler was born in Crawfordsville, Indiana, as the youngest of 4 children. He had many stepfathers who abused him. He was struggling coming out as a homosexual. Eyler dropped out of high school and got his GED. He later moved to Terre Haute, Indiana, for college and stabbed a young man named Craig Long. Craig Long survived and got Eyler arrested. Eyler pleaded guilty and got fined a whopping $43. A couple of months later, he went on a stabbing spree, except this time, he intended to kill them. In the next 2 years, he would go on a rampage. He moved to Indianapolis, Indiana after murdering numerous people and dumping their bodies. This time, he comes out about his gay tendencies and joined a gay community. He then continued to kill gay men as everyone in the gay community grew suspicious of him. He eventually was caught and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Eyler eventually died of AIDS on March 6, 1994, in jail. His attorney announced a written confession signed by Larry Eyler that claimed he killed 21 people. Number 9, William Bonin. William Bonin was born on January 8, 1947, in California. William Bonin was into killing young men the age of 17 to 21. He would lure them in his van with promises of drugs or other things and strangle them, beat them, and kill them. He would get the nickname the Freeway Killer because a lot of his victims were found dumped on the side of the freeway. Bonin killed 14 boys from 1979 to 1980. Bonin had many accomplices who would help him lure, sodomize, and kill many boys. One example of his horrific crimes was him and one accomplice lured a shopping cart collector at the grocery store into their van with the promise of drugs. They forced the boy to ingest chloral hydrate, which left chemical burns on the boy's mouth, face, chin, and stomach. He then stabbed him with an ice pick through his right ear and dumped his body near an industrial park by the freeway. Bonin was caught and executed by lethal injection on February 23, 1996. Bonin was the first California inmate to be executed by lethal injection. Number 8, Patrick Kearney. Patrick Kearney was born in 1940 in Texas. He was raised the youngest of 3 sons. He was very small, so he was bullied at school and often fantasized about killing people. Patrick, like many other serial killers, was a homosexual. He moved to Orange, California after a divorce. He killed a few people in Orange and then moved to Redondo Beach. He married a young lover named David Hill. When him and Hill would argue, he would go out for a long drive and pick up hitchhikers or go to gay bars and then kill them. He was a necrophile and would shoot his victims, then cut them up and put them in garbage bags and dump them. He never inflicted suffering on his victims and would shoot them first and then would have sex with them and then cut them up. Kearney was only 5'5", so he would choose victims who were bigger than him to resemble bullies of his childhood. Kearney was eventually caught and fled to Texas, but later turned himself in California and admitted to 28 murders. He was eventually charged with 21 counts of murder and served 21 life sentences. Number 7, Earl Nelson. Earl Leonard Nelson was born on May 12, 1897 in San Francisco, California. He was the first known American serial sex murderer. He was a rapist and also a necrophile. Both his parents died of syphilis before he turned 2. He was raised by his grandmother. He had a very rough childhood and got into trouble frequently. He was sentenced to 2 years in San Quentin at the age of 15 for breaking and entering. In 1921, at the age of 21, Nelson tried to rape a 12-year-old girl, but was caught in the act. He was put into a mental hospital, but escaped many times. He started killing in 1926 and would kill landladies after claiming he wanted to rent a room. He once slept with the body of a 14-year-old girl under his bed for 3 nights straight. He would kill his victims and then engage in sexual activities with their corpses. Nelson fled city to city up the west coast of America, all the way to Canada, and eventually was caught and hanged in 1928 in Canada. Number 6. Ronald Dominique. Ronald Dominique was born on January 9, 1964, in Bayou Blue, Louisiana. Ronald was a homosexual and would rape his victims, and then out of fear of not wanting to go back to jail, he would kill his victims and then dump their bodies in sugarcane fields. He often went to gay bars and would kill people he thought would have sex for money. He would pick up men and lure them into his car, promising drugs or sex with fictitious women, and would kill the men when they agreed to be tied up for sexual pleasure. Dominique was arrested after having a police report against him from a man that wouldn't let Dominique tie him up. That man was found dead 2 months later, and Dominique was arrested. He confessed to killing over 20 men in a 10-year period. He's currently serving 8 life sentences. Number 5. Juan Corona. Juan Corona was born in 1934 in Mexico. He came to the United States illegally in the 1950s and earned a living as a labor contractor. Corona found migrant workers from Mexico and used them on fruit fields for labor in Sutter County. He would hire workers and then promise to pay them, but never would pay them and would just kill them and bury them in fruit fields where they worked. His means of killing was by machete. The men he killed usually knew very little people and were drifters and alcoholics, and none were reported missing. He was eventually caught by the owner of a fruit farm after having seen a hole the size of a person in the ground dug one day, and then the next day was filled in. Juan Corona was sentenced to 25 life sentences and died in prison on March 4th, 2019. Number 4. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. John Gacy dropped out of high school and left Chicago for Las Vegas. He got a job at a mortuary as a janitor, but didn't like it and moved back to Chicago shortly after. He enrolled in business college afterwards and was a natural salesman. He married a wealthy lady and moved to Waterloo, Iowa. He eventually took over his wife's family chicken restaurant, and everyone loved him in his community. John eventually pled guilty to sodomy and sentenced to 10 years. His wife divorced him afterwards. He was paroled after 18 months. He went back to Chicago and started his own construction company. John went through another divorce at the time. He would hire young boys to work for his company, and then he would eventually kill them after owing them money. 28 graves were found under his home, where he buried young men, and was eventually convicted of killing 33 young men. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His last words were, "Kiss my ass." Number 3. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. Ted grew up never knowing who his father was. He was raised by his grandparents and was told his grandparents were his real parents and his mom was his sister. Him and his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington in 1950. Ted was very introverted and didn't know how to make friends or act in social situations. Ted eventually went to Seattle's University of Washington. No one is sure where or when Ted started killing. He said he kidnapped someone first in 1969, but didn't start killing until 1971. He eventually confessed to killing 36 young women in the 1970s. He traveled many states and killed many women while doing so. Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado were where he traveled while killing. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested for cruising a neighborhood before the sun was up. The police found many kidnapping items in his car after a high-speed chase. He escaped jail twice after being jailed and was eventually caught in Florida after having traveled many states nearby. Bundy was eventually executed by electric chair on January 24, 1989. He died at the age of 42. Number 2. Gary Ridgway. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was raised in the Seattle-Tacoma area. His mom was abusive towards him. Gary was tested and had a low IQ of 82. He stabbed a boy when he was 16 and laughed about it. Gary went to the Navy at 18. Gary was very religious. He had many failed marriages, and his wives described him as having an extremely high sex drive. Ridgway would pick up prostitutes along the Pacific Highway South or runaway women and kill them. He was given the name the Green River Killer because he left a lot of bodies near the Green River. He was eventually caught from a saliva sample that had his sperm in it. Ridgway was offered a plea bargain to not be executed if he showed police where more bodies were. He confessed to murdering 71 women and is currently spending life in prison without parole in Washington State Penitentiary. Number 1. Samuel Little. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. Samuel was born to a prostitute. After his birth, his family moved to Lorain, Ohio, where he was raised by his grandmother. He got into a little bit of trouble as a young boy and man, mostly for breaking and entering. Samuel was acquitted to 2 murders in Mississippi. He then moved to San Diego, California. He was arrested for attempted murder to 2 women and served 2.5 years. He then moved to Los Angeles and then committed 10 more murders. He was arrested in 2012 for a 1987 murder that had DNA linking to him. A few months later, he was linked to dozens of murders from the late 80s. He was tested for the involvement of over 60 murders. He is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole in California State Prison, Los Angeles County.